so pleased to introduce the speaker today. And I'm going to give you a little backstory to why she's here and how she got here. So, you drive around the district, drive around the world, really go around the world, and all you see are invasive species strangling everything: trees, bushes, shrubs, highway signs, fences, golf courses, everything. So I'm driving down Del Collier Parkway to get to Canal Road to go over Chain Bridge. And Canal Road, I just felt that these species were just engulfing me. They were coming over my head. They were coming out into the road. And I'm freaking out. I'm going, I've seen this before, but now I'm really reacting to it. And I thought, this is the beginning of a horror movie. So I said, what am I going to do about this? So I called my dear friend, Elizabeth McGowan, who's my guest today. And not only is she an award-winning environmental journalist, but she's also a permitted Rock Creek Park weed whacker. Now, they don't call it a weed whacker, they call it a weed warrior. But she's a weed whacker because she whacks everything in Rock Creek Park. But she whacks what needs to be whacked, right? She identifies that. So I told her about my visceral reaction to this invasive species encroachment. And I said, I'd love to know more about it. What's being done about it? How can we, what's going to happen to us? Are we going to get engulfed? So she said, no, there are people doing stuff. And she introduced me to Liz Crafford, and Dr. Liz Crafford, by the way. And so I gave her a call. We talked, and she said, oh my gosh, this is what my mission is, to tell people, what is the problem, which we all kind of know, but what's the solution? So I want to read you her bio because it's quite impressive. So her whole talk today is on invasive plants in your neighborhood and the problem and the solution. So she's a geologist by training, and after earning her PhD from UC Berkeley in the early 90s, she worked in the mining industry, in academia, and most recently with the Global Volcanism Program at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. When she moved to DC from Anchorage in 2014, Liz began planting native plants in her garden and learning about local flora and native plant habitats. And while working at home during the pandemic, she began to recognize the extent of the invasive plant problem at nearby Rock Creek Park. So after training with the National Park Service, she became a permitted Rock Creek weed warrior. So you have to go through training, you have to be permitted, and she's leading the charge in that regard. And she works to remove invasive plants from the park and with other weed warriors. In addition, she started a local group in her neighborhood, the Shepherd Park Weed Warriors, to work on invasive plant removal in city and private land adjacent to the park. Last spring, she participated in the DC Master Naturalist Program at UDC. And now she's volunteering in that capacity to teach others about invasive plant removal and the importance of restoring native plants to the natural areas all around us. So it's my honor to welcome DC Master Naturalist and Geologist, Dr. Liz Crafford.
First off, I will say a thank you to both Elizabeth and Nancy for the opportunity to speak with you this afternoon and share my passion about land stewardship. I'm a geologist turned weed warrior and master naturalist who enjoys sharing with anyone who will listen the importance of how we can better steward our land for the benefit of all. Today, I'm going to discuss invasive plants in your community, what you should know about them, and what you can do about the problems they pose for you and your community. I would be remiss not to thank the many people and the groups who have facilitated my learning of this fascinating topic and who have provided me the opportunity to contribute in a meaningful way towards positive change in my community. Without their insights and guidance, I would not be here sharing what I have learned with you today. So Thank you to them all. So what is the fuss with invasive plants? What actually is the problem and why should we care? To address those questions, I'm going to touch on what we mean by an ecosystem and what we mean by native or local species, non-native plants, and invasive plants. I want to share with you how these things impact your world for better or worse, and to help you understand how we got to this place and how we can get out of this place with an eye towards hope for the future and making our world a slightly better place through our efforts. So here's Exhibit A. You have all seen this somewhere, I'm sure. Curtains of vines covering entire trees, draped over shrubs, carpeting the ground, dense vines climbing up trunks of trees, and obscuring everything underneath. Is this normal? Does it matter? Is it a good thing? I suspect you know the answer to this question, at least in part. The short answer, of course, is it's not a good thing. These are what we call invasive plants. They are killing the other plants and trees and also destroying habitat for everything native that is part of our ecosystem. And this is not a good thing. The real harm that they do goes well beyond the unaesthetic look of the tangle of vines. They actually destroy our ecosystems. So let's take a closer look at what we mean by ecosystem and why this is truly a problem. An ecosystem in its simplest form is really just a bunch of different things that all depend upon one another. In our people-centric world, we have many kinds of ecosystems with many interdependent parts. Think of healthcare systems, education systems, transportation systems. They all require many different working parts for the whole thing to function. If some part of that system collapses, the whole system is endangered. Remember the supply chain issues of the pandemic? A great example of an ecosystem that fell apart. To understand what we mean by a living ecosystem, we need to add one important thing to our definition, and that is to recognize that there's a dimension of place that is critical to understanding how a living ecosystem works. So we can define a living ecosystem as a complex network of interdependent organisms together in a particular place. In a living ecosystem, all living things, plants, animals, and everything else, depend on one another and on the non-living components of the Earth's surface to sustain all life, and that includes ours, of course. This comes about because living things need energy to survive, grow, and reproduce. And this energy comes in some form from the sun and the other living things around it. This fundamental drive to survive is what creates this network of interdependent organisms in a particular geographic place that we recognize as a living ecosystem. They turn out to be incredibly complex and dynamic, and we're only just beginning to understand them. When we look at a traditional image of a food web or a food chain, like you learned about in grade school, we need to think of it as more than just a general concept of one creature eating another. Its application is actually always to a specific geographic locale. We have certain species of organisms, the decomposers, that live in the soil and provide nutrients to certain species of plants. Those certain species of plants are the limited food source for specific insects, birds, and mammals. Those creatures, in turn, provide for other consumers. When those creatures die, they're recycled back into the soil with the help of the particular decomposers in that place. And so the cycle goes. So why is this, you might ask? Why does a living ecosystem need to refer to a particular place? The answer, it turns out, is because of a conflict between different timescales for the processes involved in creating a healthy ecosystem. And this is the geologist in me sharing the insight of geologic time with you. It takes thousands of years for the Earth's organisms that are living together in a specific local ecosystem to arrive at a dynamic, sustainable balance where populations are stable. This evolution by adaptation happens at a near geologic timescale, not a human one. It takes decades or centuries for plants or animals to naturally migrate their species across the landscape from one location to another. But humans and their goods and services travel around the globe at a relatively instantaneous speed of hours to days. So we have this very slow evolutionary adaptation process of thousands of years, a slow natural biologic dispersal process of hundreds of years, and the very fast human travel speed that's very fast relative to those. And what happens is these timescales all crash into one another in our modern developed landscapes and adjacent natural areas. And this conflict of timescales is what brings us to the idea of a local or native versus invasive species. With this understanding of what a local ecosystem is, we're ready to appreciate the distinction between local species, non-native species, and invasive species. A local or native species is one that is living in a certain place where it's co-evolved over thousands of years with other local species of many organisms. As a result, it provides certain resources to the other native organisms as part of a balanced ecosystem. Our legal definition of native species, then, is simply a species that historically or currently occurs in a particular ecosystem. A non-native species, as I suspect you can guess, is an organism that occurs outside of its natural range. It is coexisting with species with which it did not co-evolve. Many non-native species, such as agricultural crops and ornamental plants, are harmless and even beneficial to humans and have shown no tendency to escape cultivation or become invasive. The gladiolus, for example, is a bulb native to Africa and the Mediterranean, not North America, but it's commonly grown in gardens here, including mine, and I'm not aware of any reports of it becoming invasive in North America. This brings us to our definition of an invasive plant. It is a non-native plant that is growing with plants and insects with which it did not co-evolve, whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. This text in red is the important part of our legal definition. Because of their growth habits, seed production, and dispersal characteristics, invasive plants eventually escape into wild and unmanaged areas, outcompeting and displacing native plants. So I'd like now to share with you two case studies that demonstrate the concepts we've talked about of interdependent organisms in a local ecosystem. The first example is about the monarch and the milkweed. Some of you will be very familiar with this, right, Bill? As we've discussed, all right, good, perfect. As we've discussed, in a living ecosystem, every living thing seeks ways to defend itself and ways to thrive and grow. Milkweed plants have evolved a sticky, milky sap that is toxic to most things that would eat it, and it therefore successfully limits predation to very few creatures. The monarch's desire to thrive has resulted in its developing resistance to the milkweed sap. The monarch is able to metabolize the sap and actually use it to bolster its defenses against its predators. A juvenile blue jay will get a mouthful of terrible tasting toxin when it tries to eat a monarch caterpillar and is unlikely to repeat the effort. This adaptation comes at a cost, however, to the monarch. Milkweed has become the only food source it has. The monarch butterfly must lay its eggs on a milkweed plant so that the young caterpillar that hatches from that egg will have a food source that enables it to grow to its full size before turning into a beautiful chrysalis that magically transforms back into this iconic butterfly. For me, witnessing this entire cycle of life in my own yard, simply because I provided the milkweed plants, was entirely transformative and is largely why I'm sharing this information with you today. Sadly, data collected over the last 30 years on eastern migratory monarch populations demonstrates that habitat loss of overwintering sites in Mexico, pesticide-based agriculture, and loss of milkweed plants has had a devastating impact on monarch populations. While populations appear to have stabilized since 2014, in 2020, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed them as a candidate for the Endangered Species Act. In 2023, the IUCN put them in their vulnerable category, one step from their red list of globally endangered species. The spectacular annual migratory journey of nearly 4,000 kilometers over multiple generations deserves whatever protection measures we can provide for them, including planting milkweeds in as many places across their migration route as we possibly can. The second example of interdependent organisms in local ecosystems involves three different things: the chickadees, the caterpillars, and the native plants they consume. Research has shown us that 80% of caterpillar species are what we call specialist feeders. This means they use 3 or fewer genera of plants for food. Some can eat plants for only one genus, like the monarch. Very few can consume non-native plants. Native plants, like oak trees, support a far greater number of species of caterpillars than non-native plants. In some places, oak trees are host plants to more than 400 species of caterpillars. A non-native ginkgo tree, for example, in contrast, supports only 5 species of caterpillars in North America. Research has also shown that 90% of baby birds need pure protein to grow. Caterpillars are the #1 food source for pure protein for baby birds. Researchers working with entomologist Doug Tallamy discovered that it takes between 6 and 9,000, I'll repeat that, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of chickadees from egg to fledgling. In the test areas where the researchers were studying chickadee nests, they noted that in places where more than 30% of the plants were non-native, chickadees either did not nest at all or had lower fledgling survival rates. A conclusion of the research then was that successful chickadee survival requires an ecosystem with greater than 70% native plants in order to support sufficient quantities of caterpillars to feed and grow a nest of fledgling chickadees and thus sustain the population of the species. The sad reality of research published in 2019 is that the adult breeding population of North American birds has declined by 2.9 billion birds, or nearly 30% of the population since 1970. Lack of food for caterpillars is one of the reasons why. To further underscore the problems with invertebrate population decline in general, global research in 2014 demonstrated that 450 studied species of invertebrates, by this we mean all insects, had a 45% decline in populations over 40 years. They are indeed the little things that run the world, as described by biologist E.O. Wilson, and they represent a remarkable 96% of known species, according to the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Habitat loss is the biggest cause of the decline in invertebrate abundance worldwide. Human land use, of course, is the biggest cause of habitat loss. When insect populations decline globally, they are affecting all ecosystems locally by depleting a key organism that is part of the web of life that sustains that local ecosystem. A closer look at how we are responsible for habitat loss can help us to better define the problem and come up with appropriate solutions. Well, it's clear that we eliminate habitat for other organisms like insects, birds, and other animals through building, agriculture, and transportation construction. It's less obvious that we also eliminate habitat through designing non-sustainable land environments around those buildings and transportation systems. The biggest piece of that in terms of acreage turns out to be the lawn that we grow around everything in our developed environment. It is not native and it doesn't support organisms that would ordinarily live in a local ecosystem. 3 times as many acres, in fact, are planted with lawns as with corn in the United States. That's 44 million acres of lawn. Virtually all landscapes that we've altered through development are non-sustainable ecosystems, unless we deliberately design them to be otherwise, which we can actually do and are beginning to do, thankfully. The fact that most designed landscapes currently consist of primarily non-native plants, many of which are invasive, leads us to another less noticed but more insidious effect from our land use development. Next slide, please. And Nancy even used the words already. And that is habitat loss from invasive encroachment. Some of the non-native plants that we use in our developed landscapes escape, become invasive, and encroach into the natural areas that we're deliberately trying to protect. They displace native species and break down local ecosystems. Because the rate of encroachment is years or decades, it goes unnoticed by all but the experts for a long time, and by then, much damage has been done. The ecosystems of our own Rock Creek Park are compromised by the presence of invasive plant material. It's found in most areas throughout the park. The health of all our national parks is constantly being monitored and measured with many different metrics by the National Park Service. One of those metrics is the exotic herb density. This is represented as the number of test plots throughout the park that contain non-native plants. In Rock Creek Park, 60.5% of the plots contain non-native plants. The presence of these plants in the park is the result of invasive encroachment from plants originally located outside of the park. So how did they get there? Horticulture and agriculture industries have brought these plants to North America, and many different dispersal agents, including wind, water, birds, deer, and humans, have spread these plants into our natural areas where they've thrived and reproduced. I'm sure that all of you recognize some of these plants, and I suspect some of you may recognize all of these plants. They're all harmful invasive plants that have invaded the natural areas of the mid-Atlantic. Some of them have been around for more than a century. So I've painted kind of a grim picture of things, and I want to turn the page and give you reasons for optimism and hope. You too can enjoy the beautiful sights like the one in this photograph from my yard, in your yard or neighborhood or local park, with a surprisingly small effort of your own. So what can we do now? The good news is that there is much we can do to change this. It is not a lost cause. We can change how we think about our land, and we can change how we actually care for our land. The idea for how to do this is not new. Indeed, wisdom from our elders from decades ago. Aldo Leopold penned an essay in the 1940s that laid out a new kind of ethic of caring for the land. It was radical for its time and out of step with our hyper-industrialized 20th century. Largely ignored in its time, it has now become a classic revered by many. His words resonate more loudly now than ever before as we face the existential environmental crises of our current moment in time. Leopold said, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." We would do well to heed his advice this time around and try to change how we think about our land and how we care about our land. So, what can we do to change how we care about our land at home? We can recognize that what we plant in the ground matters. It matters to our health and to the health of everything else living in our communities. We can change the way we care for things at home by identifying the plants growing on our properties, by committing to removing the invasive plants growing on our properties, and by adding local native plants to our yards, aiming for 70% minimum. And we can learn best practices for stewardship of our properties. Next slide. Some of the best practices for good stewardship include reducing the area of lawn where we live and work, leaving native plant stems and leaves where they grow and fall, refraining from pesticide and herbicide use as much as possible, recycling as much natural material as possible in our own yards, reducing stormwater runoff from our properties to adjacent impervious surfaces which then pollutes local streams and waterways. Besides changing how you care for your things at home, there are also ways you can change how you care in your community as well. The changes in your community can come from individuals or groups or both. You can volunteer with friends or colleagues at an invasive removal event sponsored by the National Park Service or a qualified nonprofit like the Rock Creek Conservancy or Ward 8 Woods. You can become a weed warrior or forest steward. Please remember that it's not legal to remove anything from the national park without a permit. Anna told me I had to say that. And training is required before the permit is issued. There are actually many native vines and plants that look similar to invasive ones, but are very important to the local ecosystem and need to be protected. You can organize neighborhood invasive plant cleanup activities. You can educate your neighbors about the scope of the problem. Other ways that you can affect change in your community are to support local nonprofits working on local natural area conservation and restoration. You can sponsor green job initiatives. You can contribute to education initiatives about land stewardship. And you can be a voice for legislative change to protect and care for natural areas in your community. So finally, I want to leave you with the idea that if I can do this, you can do it too. 2 years ago, I set out with my neighbors to remove the invasive plants growing next to our local soccer field. I also began volunteering with like-minded folks in Rock Creek Park and became a certified park weed warrior. Little did I know where these efforts would lead me beyond improving the health of my local ecosystem. The terrific feeling of rescuing a tree from a tangle of vines will stay with you for a long time. And the feeling multiplies each time you succeed. It's also led me to a wonderful fellowship with like-minded folks and a remarkable feeling of accomplishment. In addition, our voices have contributed, along with others in the community, to help bring about legislation to improve how the district cares for its natural areas throughout the city. As the nation's capital, we also have an unprecedented opportunity to be a real voice, bringing awareness to these issues at a national level. So make your voice heard. If I can do this, you can too. If you're interested in following up on these ideas and taking action in some way, I hope that you are. There are great local nonprofits you can support and many local resources to learn from, whether it's a desire to learn about native plant gardening or to get involved with invasive plant removal in your community, or even just to read further on the topics I've discussed and find your own way to contribute. Thanks very much for your time and attention this afternoon, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
So thank you very much for that presentation and make me understand what it is to do. I teach golf at Rock Creek, mostly kids, some adults, and a lot of women that want to play golf. So I've seen your crew or your people out there on Friday mornings, on Thursday mornings doing this. I really didn't understand it. They talked and told me a little bit about it, and I look good. My question to you is, you know, I'm sure you do, about the remodeling of the golf courses and the story in the Washington Post about 1,200 trees coming down to remodel the golf course. What they didn't mention is they're going to replant 500 trees, and some of those 1,200 trees are dead, no good, and are probably invasive.
That you're absolutely right. It wasn't presented the whole picture. Something like 200 or 300 of those trees are invasive trees we don't want there anyway.
Right. And the rest, a lot of the others are dead.
Anyway, looking at the yards, this is something that because I do the rain gardens and basecaping and urban forest, all three of those, and we helped start that in DC. But looking at all these yards, besides the 44 million acres, which is not being productive in any way, except people want to have grass, 40 to 60% of the water used in the average American home goes to that yard. 40 to 60%. So if you multiply that by the millions of homes that are doing that, we're losing a tremendous amount of water. And most of those yards are very hard packed clay, and it's running off down the street. So how do we convince people to start going to native species plants, which in Washington, D.C., as long as you put up the sign, this is approved native species or a butterfly flyway, you can get by without having grass. How do we do that? And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a great question, and I encourage all of you to read this book, Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy, because at the heart of it is there's a culture of people loving their green lawns. It's not environmentally a good practice at all, but it's very hard to change a culture where we've actually written laws that say, if you live in this community, you have to have only green grass growing. Thankfully, there is now legislation beginning to defeat that. In Maryland, the woman who wrote this book, called Wildscapes, Nancy Lawson, her sister lived in a homeowners association that was trying to tell her she couldn't grow native plants. And they won. They got the Maryland legislature to pass a bill saying you can't do that. You have to allow people to grow native plants and things in their yard. So part of it is a change in how we think about things. Part of it is simply there's lots of ways to landscape beautifully with native plants in your yard. And you have to say, oh, maybe I can have a border of native plants. They don't have to be tall and ugly and gangly. But the idea that they have to be neat and tidy is also not natural and not okay. The beauty that you will find in your yard from the dead twigs and the seed heads, I can testify personally, will astound you. Having grown up in a classical neat and tidy universe, when I finally let things grow in my yard and I watch the wildlife come, those monarchs just showed up in my yard. And I dropped my coffee mug and screamed the day I saw the beautiful caterpillar and watched the whole process unfold. And I think so it's having people take a leap of faith. Gosh, I can make this change. And it's actually a change for the better for everybody. And then it goes from there.
So one of the things is we all have, not we all, but there are a lot of landscapers out there who redo your yard and make it look beautiful. And I had my landscaper, I was talking about what I wanted, oh, I like that bush. I like the look of that bush in that book. No, we will not plant those because those are not native. They're invasive. And if your landscaper is putting in invasive, you got to find another landscaper.
That's a really, really good point. Let's see. Lots of questions. Go ahead.
I have an arranging deck chairs on the Titanic kind of question here, and I applaud what you're doing, but it's like I feel as though I'm being asked to rearrange my lawn, and I should, but at the same time, we're allowing the fossil fuel industry and other giant multinational corporations to despeciate the planet as they rape, burn, and pillage the environment. So what do we do about that?
Great question. And maybe I can pass that to another speaker for a bigger answer. I guess my short answer is every little thing everybody does adds up. And there's Doug Tallamy has an organization that's called Homegrown National Park. And the whole idea is that if you start to transform those tiny pieces of acreage, especially when they start to connect to one another, you're creating these pathways and corridors. If you build it, they truly will come. Insects run the world, and that was what supports everything else.
Last summer, when I asked my 91-year-old mother what, I could help her with, and she hadn't even been out in her yard, she said, well, look at the back of the yard. Do you see those invasive plants? I want you. And I was like, no, I just see the white, pretty flower. She's like, no, that's an invasive plant. And it's running from here, here, here. And she's in the house, by the way, not even out in the yard. She sees it. So I go out and I whack weeds for hours, her guidance. And then here's the punchline. I left, but she instructed the guy who cuts her grass. By the way, this is in Shepherd Park. The guy who cuts her grass and cuts the lawns of 20 other residential properties. She showed him, kind of what an invasive plant looks like and showed him how to pull it. And so the point is, if we can focus even on like, the lawn guys and gals who may have 20 homes, they can play a big role, beyond just one lawn. They can hit 20. And so that's every little thing helps, which could become a lot larger. So anyway.
The tomatoes and potatoes, they come from United States and we start to have it in Italy.
Right.
Yeah. Do they create some problem in the Italian ecosystem?
That's a great question. They could, but they don't necessarily. There's many agricultural products that go around the world and aren't invasive plants, but they could be. And and everyone needs to pay a lot more attention to whether any plant is or is not when it's traveling around. That needs to be a fundamental criteria. If a plant's going to go grow on another continent, it's like, wait a minute, what are going to be the unintended consequences of that?
We have a tradition here at our club, and where we plant a tree, a non-invasive plant for each for each of our speakers. And so you will have a tree that you can find online. You just look at the coordinates and you actually have a tree. And here is a beautiful pin. So thank you for speaking to us today and sharing us your knowledge. And thank you for your free books.